The day a thug slapped an 81-year-old veteran. The crack of a hand against an old man's face silenced the diner. An 81-year-old veteran, his dignity bruised more than his cheek, sat trembling in the morning light. No one spoke. No one moved. But fate had a way of opening doors at the exact moment hearts needed courage. Every morning at 8:15, Harold Bennett walked into Lou's diner. The bell above the door chimed the same soft tune it had for years. He wore the same flannel jacket, brown with faded elbows and boots cracked at the seams but still holding him upright. He always chose the corner booth by the wide glass window. It was his spot, where sunlight pooled onto the chrome tabletop and warmed his weathered hands. The waitress didn't need to ask what he wanted. Black coffee, 2 eggs, toast slathered with butter. Sometimes she slipped him a slice of pie, pretending it was on the house. Harold always tipped even when he shouldn't. The diner wasn't just a place to eat. It was sanctuary, a refuge from silence at home. The kind of place where he wasn't the veteran, just Mr. Bennett, the polite old man with steady eyes and soft words. On that autumn morning, as Harold lifted his steaming coffee to his lips, he thought the day would be just like all the others, quiet, predictable, safe. But safety, like sunlight, can vanish in the blink of an eye. At the counter sat a man Harold had never seen before. Thick-necked, broad-shouldered, eyes restless like a cornered dog. His voice carried across the room sharp as breaking glass. $5 for bacon? You trying to rob me? He barked, palm slamming the counter. The silverware rattled. The waitress froze, whispering, "Sir, please, keep your voice down." The man sneered, leaning closer, his words cutting the air. Other customers bent their heads low, pretending to focus on eggs and pancakes. Fear made them statues. Harold watched. Not with anger, not with judgment. Just quiet observation. His gaze was steady, the kind of calm only men who'd faced bullets knew. And maybe that was the problem. The stranger's eyes snapped to Harold, narrowing like a knife's edge. "What you staring at, old man?" Harold didn't answer. He lowered his gaze to his coffee, steam blurring his reflection. But silence wasn't enough. Not for a man like this. He stood, the scrape of his chair slicing the air. Boots thudded across tile. The diner's hum collapsed into stillness. The stranger's shadow fell over Harold's booth. "Say something," the stranger demanded, leaning in, his breath heavy with cigarettes. Harold's hands remained folded neatly on the table, knuckles pale but steady. The man's lip curled. And then, crack. His palm struck Harold's cheek. The sound thundered through the diner, louder than any jukebox song, sharper than any shout. Forks froze midair. Coffee cups rattled against saucers. A baby whimpered in the corner booth, silenced by its mother's trembling arms. Harold's head snapped sideways from the force, his cheek instantly flushed red. Slowly, carefully, he raised his hand, not to strike back but to hold the sting as though he were steadying himself against a memory. He didn't cry out. He didn't fight back. His eyes blinked with sorrow, not fear. The stranger smirked, chest puffed with ugly pride. He leaned back, satisfied with the silence he had created. The diner, once alive with morning chatter, now held only the weight of shame. Dozens of eyes avoided Harold's. No one moved. No one spoke. And Harold sat still, his coffee cooling in front of him, his dignity intact but his spirit heavy. The diner tried to breathe again, but the air was thick. The waitress gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. "Sir," she whispered, "please, just leave." The thug leaned against the counter, smug grin plastered across his face. He had won his little war, against an old man who had fought real ones. Harold didn't move. His back was straight, his posture unbroken. Yet his silence weighed more than words. He had known violence before. Machine guns rattling in foreign lands, nights spent wondering if dawn would come. But this cruelty at home pierced deeper. He wasn't hurt for himself. He was hurt for the world, for a generation that no longer paused to respect age, sacrifice, or history, for the way a room full of people could let fear anchor them to their seats. He traced the rim of his coffee cup with one finger, circling again and again as if grounding himself in the only thing that hadn't changed. Minutes passed like hours. His cheek throbbed, but his heart throbbed louder. And then, the bell above the diner door jingled. The door swung wide. A gust of crisp autumn air rushed in. carrying with it the scent of leather and gasoline. Heavy boots thudded against tile. Jackets stitched with bold insignias caught the sunlight. The Hells Angels had arrived. At their center walked a tall man, broad-shouldered, beard streaked with gray. His eyes scanned the diner, sharp and searching, until they stopped at Harold. His face shifted, tough exterior cracking into recognition. "Dad," he said, voice low but heavy with something deeper. A hush swept the diner. Heads lifted, eyes darted. Harold's hand stilled against his cup. For a moment he thought his ears had tricked him, but when he looked up, he saw what he hadn't in years. His son, Thomas Bennett, the boy he had once held after nightmares. The teenager who had stormed out, choosing steel and leather over the steady life Harold hoped for. The man who hadn't spoken to him in nearly a decade, and yet here he was. Thomas crossed the diner, his biker brothers like shadows at his side. He slid into the booth opposite Harold, placed a calloused hand over his father's trembling one, and said nothing. Because nothing was needed. The room was frozen, all eyes on them. Thomas didn't flinch at the bruise blooming on his father's cheek. He didn't need to ask what happened. The story was written there in red and silence. For years, Harold and Thomas had lived separate lives. War had hardened Harold, but disappointment had hollowed him. Thomas had chosen the road, the brotherhood of bikers, a life Harold never understood. Distance had become easier than reconciliation, but in that diner, history folded back on itself. Harold's voice cracked. "It's been a long time," Thomas nodded. His jaw clenched, eyes locked on his father's face. "Too long," the waitress, unsure, whispered. "Coffee?" Thomas shook his head. His focus didn't waver. He reached across the table again, his hand resting over Harold's. For once, the room saw not a biker, not a veteran, just a son and a father, reconnected in silence. But silence wasn't the only thing pressing down on the room. The thug at the counter finally noticed. His grin spread again, twisted with arrogance. "What, you need your gang to protect you, old man?" The diner held its breath. The thug stood tall, puffing his chest like a man unaware of his own foolishness. His words dripped with contempt. "You got bikers babysitting you now?" Thomas didn't move. His men, however, shifted behind him, silent, watchful, a wall of muscle and ink. Thomas finally looked up, his gaze steady, his voice even. "That man you struck? He's my father." The words hung like thunder. Gasps rippled through the diner. The thug's smirk faltered, though he tried to mask it with a laugh. Thomas leaned forward, his tone low but sharp as steel. "My father is 81 years old. A veteran. He gave more for this country than you'll ever give. And you thought it made you tough to hit him?" The thug's laughter cracked. He glanced around, seeking support, but found only silence. The customer's stares had shifted, from fear to quiet condemnation. Thomas didn't raise his fist. He didn't need to. His presence, his words carried weight heavier than violence. The biker brothers stood behind him like shadows, unspoken power filling the room. The thug swallowed hard. For the first time, his bravado wavered. The thug shifted, trying to laugh it off, but the sound was brittle, hollow. His eyes darted from Thomas to Harold, then to the silent room. Every gaze felt like a mirror, showing him his own weakness. Thomas didn't break eye contact. Men like you think respect is taken, but real men, they give it. Silence followed, deep as a church. The waitress trembled behind the counter, tears brimming. A man at the back booth finally raised his head, shame flickering in his eyes for not acting sooner. The thug's shoulders sank. His swagger drained away, leaving only a man exposed. He muttered under his breath, words no one cared to catch, and shuffled toward the door. His boots no longer stomped with arrogance. They dragged with shame. The bell above the door jingled again, softer this time, and then he was gone. No one clapped. No one cheered. The victory was not in noise, but in silence. Harold exhaled, shoulders lowering for the first time that morning. His son had not needed fists to defend him. He had used something stronger, loyalty. The waitress hurried forward, her hand still shaking, and poured fresh coffee into Harold's cup. She glanced at Thomas, whispering, "Thank you." Thomas only nodded. He wasn't here for thanks. He was here for his father. Harold stared at the steaming cup. For hours it had sat cold, untouched, a reminder of silence and shame. Now, with his son across from him, it felt warm again. He lifted it slowly, his hand steadied by the one resting over his. His eyes met Thomas's. "I fought battles long ago," he said, voice rough, "but nothing. Nothing compares to the fight of keeping your family close." Thomas's tough exterior cracked for just a moment. His throat bobbed as he swallowed emotion he couldn't speak. Around them, the diner stirred back to life. Customers whispered words of respect. A man in a suit approached, laying a hand on Harold's shoulder. "Sir, I'm sorry I didn't stand up sooner. You deserved better." Harold nodded, not with bitterness, but with quiet grace. The diner had witnessed cruelty that morning, but it was also witnessing healing. Harold's thoughts drifted as he sat with his son. Years of distance replayed in his mind like an old film. Nights waiting for a call that never came. Holidays spent in silence. Letters written, but never mailed. Thomas had chosen the road, the brotherhood of bikers. To Harold it had felt like rebellion. To Thomas, it had been survival. They had misunderstood each other, and pride had built walls neither knew how to climb. But here, in the smell of coffee and fried eggs with strangers watching, those walls cracked. Thomas cleared his throat. "I should have been here sooner." His voice was gravel, thick with regret. Harold shook his head gently. "You're here now." For a man who had stared down death, Harold knew the value of presence, of showing up when it mattered. And Thomas had shown up, not with fists, not with rage, but with something stronger. Respect. The years of distance still lay between them. But that morning, the bridge had been rebuilt. The biker brothers didn't sit. They stood quietly behind Thomas, their presence commanding but respectful. To outsiders, they looked like men to fear. Tattoos, leather, hardened faces. But the way they looked at Harold told a different story. One of them leaned down, murmuring, "Your old man's tough." Thomas smirked faintly. "Tougher than most." The men nodded, giving Harold subtle nods of respect. For all their reputation, they knew the meaning of loyalty. And in Harold, they saw the kind of man who had lived it before them. Harold lifted his gaze, meeting theirs. He didn't flinch. He didn't judge. In their eyes, he saw the same thing he once saw in soldiers decades ago. Men bound by brotherhood, willing to bleed for one another. And for the first time in years, Harold felt something stir in his chest. A sense of belonging. A reminder that respect wasn't about appearance, but about action. The biker brothers weren't strangers anymore. They were allies. Word of what happened spread quickly, whispered from booth to booth. The diner, once heavy with silence, began to soften. A man stood and tipped his hat to Harold. A young woman whispered, "Thank you for your service." The waitress set down pie on the table. On the house, no excuses. Her eyes brimmed with tears as she said, "You deserve better than what happened today." Harold nodded, humbled but weary. He hadn't sought recognition. All he wanted was peace. Yet in that diner, something shifted. Strangers became witnesses. Witnesses became participants. Respect, once absent, now flowed freely. Thomas glanced around, seeing the change. "You're not alone, Dad," he murmured. Harold's eyes glistened. For years he had carried loneliness like a second skin, but today reminded him that even in brokenness, healing could arrive, sometimes on the back of a motorcycle. As the room quieted again, Harold leaned forward. His voice was low, meant only for his son, though the weight of it carried across the booth. "Thomas, I didn't understand your choices. I thought you were running from me. But maybe you were just trying to find your own war to fight." Thomas's jaw tightened. "I never stopped being your son. I just didn't know how to come back." Harold's hand, thin and veined, reached across the table, gripping Thomas's tightly. "You just did." It wasn't a grand reconciliation. It wasn't a movie ending. It was something quieter, deeper. A father and son scarred by years of distance choosing finally to sit at the same table. From that day forward, Lou's Diner became more than just a place for eggs and coffee. It became a symbol. Harold and Thomas returned often, sometimes together, sometimes with the biker brothers in tow. Customers who had once averted their eyes now greeted Harold with warmth, their respect spoken in nods and handshakes. The booth by the window was no longer just Harold's refuge. It was a place of reunion, of loyalty, of healing. And every time the bell above the door jingled, people remembered the morning cruelty was silenced, not by fists but by the quiet power of family. Years later, Harold would still come to the diner, his steps slower, his hands shakier, but his spirit lighter. Thomas joined him whenever the road allowed. They didn't always speak much. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was comfortable, earned. One morning, Harold looked out the window, sunlight catching the steam of his coffee. He smiled faintly and whispered, "Respect, that's the real strength." Thomas, seated across from him, simply nodded. And those who saw them knew, even in a broken world, dignity, loyalty, and love will always find their way back home. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe, and press the bell icon to join our community of kindness. Share it with someone who needs hope today. Because in the end, respect and loyalty are the true strength of family, and the world always needs more of both.